Hi, welcome to Grant Cottage for the last in this season's presentations by Steve Trimm, who's next to me, who's been, as many of you know, has done a number of presentations on the history of the cottage and the people associated with it. Today he is portraying former President Grant in 1880 and speaking about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued 150 years ago this month. Just one housekeeping item. At the conclusion of Steve's talk, we are going to be doing tours, but we can only get about a dozen people per tour in the house, so we're going to have to kind of split you up. I will probably take a group down to the Overlook. There's some other tour guides here who can talk to you on the porch, or we can go back down to the visitor center. So we'll figure it out. We'll get everybody in, but don't please everybody demand to go on a tour immediately after the end of Steve's presentation.
And there's another option. We have an audio tour of the grounds. If you have a cell phone and a little sheet of paper explaining how to dial in, you can sit comfortably here on the porch and tour the grounds without moving.
Indeed. We're open through Columbus Day on weekends, and our last event is going to be Columbus Day weekend on the Sunday, which will be a family fun day with music and beautiful fall foliage, so we hope you can come back to that. And with that, I will pass you on to Steve.
The Emancipation Proclamation is considered one of the great documents in American history and perhaps world history. And considering the titanic struggle of our Civil War, it seems inevitable that such an important document would have been created. But the thing of it is, we've fallen into the habit now of believing that the war was fought to free the slaves. First and foremost, that was the motivation. And if we believe that, we are wrong. We have fallen into the realm of myth. When the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it was a joke. It was preposterous. It could not be enforced. It settled nothing. The Emancipation Proclamation was not what we tend to think it was. But the Emancipation Proclamation set in motion a process which is ongoing, which still affects us today, whether we are black Americans or white Americans. And it is that process that is supremely important, in my opinion. The freeing of the slaves was not inevitable. It almost didn't happen. I know. I was there. I saw the agonizing slowness with which emancipation happened. I want to tell you the story, but I can only tell it in one way, and that is from the perspective of a white man from the North who took a long time to grow in his understanding of what was right and what was wrong and what was moral and what was immoral. My story is unique, and yet I think it has this to recommend it. In its outlines, I think it reflects the ethical growth of many white people in the North during the war. And I include in that number Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln and I, and we were aware of it at the time, seemed to grow on this question. Our growth was almost uncanny. We proceeded at the same pace. And eventually we were able to hear what the better angels of our nature had been whispering for a long, long time. Make no mistake about it, the Emancipation Proclamation really did become one of those incredibly important moments in our history, because as it liberated black people, it offered the possibility for the liberation of white people as well. And I wish President Lincoln were here to tell you how his heart and his mind finally came into harmony. But he's not here, so I will have to speak for him and, in my way, for the hundreds of thousands of white people in the North who suddenly realized that the Emancipation Proclamation applied to them as much as it did to black people in the South. So let me begin my story. It is very personal, but I do think it is representative in its outlines. My father, Jesse, was an abolitionist. He utterly hated slavery. And he came by that belief in a very direct way. By profession, he was a tanner, worked in leather goods. But when he was learning the tanner's trade, he was essentially an apprentice. He was an apprentice to a man named Brown, who had a son named John. John Brown of Bleeding, Kansas, of Harper's Ferry. My father, when he was young and impressionable, was exposed to the abolition perspective, and he believed it with his heart and his soul. I was not an abolitionist. I was uneasy with slavery. I could not quite see it as a moral institution, but it was legal. And it had been legal since the founding of this country. And if geniuses like Jefferson, all the founding fathers, it was there in the Constitution. Slavery was legal. And who was I to question the geniuses who had given us our form of government? I thought this too. We are a unique experiment. We are a democracy. The laws which we have were written by people who were elected by the people. Therefore, our laws really are a reflection of what the general population thinks and feels. And the general population thinks and feels that slavery is acceptable. Now, it took me some time to evolve on this thought about democracy. It hadn't occurred to me that not even half of the white population was represented in Washington. Women couldn't vote. Didn't occur to me that almost 100% of the black population was not represented in Congress. In fact, our democracy was a very narrow thing. It took me a long time to sort that out. But in these early years, I believed in obeying the law, even if I disagreed with it. All right. In 1848, I married the love of my life, Julia Dent. She was from Missouri, and her father owned slaves. I married into a slave-owning family. My father hated slavery so much, he would not come to my wedding because my bride's father was a slave owner. Well, I knew that if Julia could, as soon as my father met Julia, he would fall in love with her. So if father wouldn't come to the wedding, I would take Julia to father. He was then living in Covington, Kentucky, right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. And I learned a lesson very early, that slavery can distort human behavior and human relationships in ways we cannot now imagine. And here's my story. Colonel Dent wished his daughter to be accompanied on her journey to meet my family by a servant. This was customary, a young slave woman. However, the most direct route from the Dent estate in Missouri to Covington, Kentucky, was through the state of Illinois, which was a free state. And if that slave girl set foot on Illinois soil, she would be free. So Colonel Dent, thinking he was doing us a favor, mapped out a route for us to Kentucky that took us 200 miles out of our way, avoided the state of Illinois, added to our expenses, but kept that woman a slave. In the end, we canceled the trip. We postponed it. And when Julia and I eventually did go east, we were on our own. The young lady did not accompany us. But that was my first insight into how crippling slavery could be for anybody it touched. All right. The Dent estate near St. Louis was called Whitehaven. A very good name. Colonel Dent was a Southerner. He'd migrated to Missouri. It wasn't a plantation. It was a large farm. He had perhaps 20 slaves. But this was the first time I'd seen slavery in person. And there was something going on I couldn't quite put my finger on. Bear with me on this. Superficially, what I seemed to be seeing was exactly what the Southern plantation owners said would be true. The slaves seemed to be childlike. They seemed unable to complete a job. They seemed terribly lazy. Colonel Dent would give them instructions. They would start to do the job, fumble the job. He would correct them. He would have to stand over them to make sure they did it right. They just seemed not as intelligent as white people, just as the Southern plantation owners said. They were so childlike, they needed a strong white man to guide their lives. Well, I saw that, but there was something wrong. It did not feel quite authentic, but I could not decipher what I was seeing and feeling. That took another 6 years. By 1854, I had left the Army. I'd been stationed in the East, I'd been stationed on the Pacific Coast, but in 1854 I resigned. And I tried farming. Colonel Dent gave Julia and myself some property, cut some acreage out of the Whitehaven estate, and I began to build Hardscrabble Farm. And I picked the right name, it was Hardscrabble. To build the farm, I hired several white workers, but I also hired some free black workers. There were free blacks in Missouri as well as slaves. And I thought, you know, the white laborers and the black laborers, they're going to sweat just as hard on the job. They're going to be away from their families for just the same amount of time. They have to feed their families. They have the same worries. I will pay them the same wage. My neighbors thought I was terribly eccentric to do that, but I did it. And I discovered something that the scales fell from my eyes. I discovered that when the black men were paid the same wage as the white men and were shown the same respect, they suddenly became bright and efficient, took pride in their craftsmanship. I realized, seeing that what had been happening and what was happening on the Dent estate was theater. The slaves were acting a role because it was the only way they could protest against being slaves. They made Colonel Dent's life much harder than it otherwise would have been. It was the only way they could protest and not be punished. That was an educational moment for me. Colonel Dent, to help me build Hardscrabble Farm, gave me a slave. His name was William. I did not want to own a slave. My friends in the area said, well, you are an eccentric Yankee. We're trying to get used to that. All right, you don't want to own a slave. Grant, you're poor. You need cash. You don't want to own a slave, sell him. William is young and fit. He'll bring hundreds and hundreds of dollars. What they didn't understand was I was just uneasy about selling a human being as I was about owning one. I couldn't sell him. I gave him his freedom. Colonel Dent wouldn't speak to me for years. I really alienated him when I did that. We come now to 1861 and the start of the war. And here was my thinking at the start of the war. This will show you how far we were from emancipation. I wrote a letter to my father, and in it I said this. I said, I think the war will be over very quickly. We will defeat the South. But the war will cause such turmoil in the South that there will be uprisings, slave uprisings on the plantations. The slaves will see their chance and they will rise. And when the war ends, because slavery is still legal, federal troops will have to go into the South to put down the slave uprisings. That was my prophecy. We know that didn't happen. But that is how things looked at the start of the war. You know that 11 states seceded, slave states. What you may have forgotten is that 3 slave states remained loyal: Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. They were called border states because they were on the border of the Confederacy. And because 3 slave states had remained loyal, this complicated infinitely the pace of emancipation, and I will explain this. In 1861, the Great Battle at Bull Run was fought in July, and the North lost. The war went on. On August 6th, the federal government passed what was called the Confiscation Act, and it authorized the seizure of property and slaves that were being used for insurrectionary purposes. August 6th. August 30th, in Missouri, General Fremont declares martial law, and he begins to confiscate the slaves and the property of slave owners. He believes, as the senior military man on the spot, he has the right to do this. Within 3 weeks, President Lincoln rescinds his proclamation, saying, General Fremont, you've overstepped your bounds. You must revise your proclamation, bring it into alignment with the Confiscation Act. And what the president meant was this: if a wagon was carrying goods to the Confederate Army, and it was driven by a slave, clearly those were insurrectionary purposes. So the wagon and the goods and the slave could be seized. But if a slave owner merely voiced his support for secession, that was not enough for the seizure of his slaves and his property. President Lincoln was trying to convince the slave owners in Missouri and the other border states that he was a reasonable man, that the issue was not slavery. The border states were teetering on joining the South. About 50% of the young men fought for the North, but 50% fought for the South. President Lincoln was trying to keep those loyal slave states in the Union. General Fremont, by the way, was the first Republican candidate for president. He ran for president in 1856. And I did not vote for him. I was sure, because he was an abolitionist, that if he was elected, there would be civil war. So in 1856, I voted for Buchanan. All right. At this point, late 1861, early 1862, runaway slaves are coming into my army camps. And like President Lincoln, I want to show the secessionists that I am a reasonable man. I wanted to show them I could be even-handed. So when the slave catchers came into my camps looking for the runaways, I expelled the slave catchers, but I also expelled the runaway slaves. And I've been ashamed of that ever since. But that is what I did. Late 1861, I had my first victory. It was at Belmont in Missouri. But it was in 1862, in February, that the first great victory occurred in the West, and I was credited with that victory. It was at Fort Henry, and then a few days later, on February 13th, my armies moved up to the second fort in this region of Tennessee, Fort Donelson. We began to surround the fort on February 13th. On February 12th, in New York City, Frederick Douglass spoke at Cooper Union. Frederick Douglass had escaped slavery as a young man. He was now one of the great spokesmen for abolition. His topic at Cooper Union was enlisting blacks in the Union Army. They were barred from service at this point. Well, eventually, the New York Tribune arrived in my camp. I always like to read the newspapers, find out what was happening around the nation. I didn't get around to reading this for quite some time. I was a little busy. But this is the paper. This was published the day after the talk. And I have held on to this because Frederick Douglass made some arguments that in the end made a great deal of difference to me on the question of abolition. And I will be referring to some of his remarks shortly. February 16th, Fort Donelson finally fell. 15,000 rebels surrendered to me. And we moved on deeper into Tennessee. It was during these weeks I was able to first read through the article, to read the speech, and I was intrigued, but I'll be honest with you, most of the arguments went in one ear and out the other. And then came the Battle of Shiloh in April of '62. In those 2 days, 23,000 lives were lost. Well, they were not all deaths, but the casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing, they totaled over 23,000 men. And for the first time, it occurred to me, the war is not going to be over soon. It is going to go on, and it is going to be bloody, beyond belief. And we're going to need more men. And suddenly I began to entertain the notion that maybe black men should be enlisted in the Union armies. Here are some quotes from Frederick Douglass's speech at Cooper Union. When I reread them, they sunk in. Though ignored by our friends and repelled by our enemies, the colored people, both North and South, have shown the most ardent desire to serve the cause of the country, as against the rebels and the traitors who are endeavoring to break it down and destroy it. That they are not represented in the loyal army is the fault of the government, and a very grievous fault it is. Frederick Douglass was a historian, and he looked back into American history, and he said, "Colored men were good enough to fight under Washington. They are not good enough to fight under McClellan. They were good enough to fight under Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. They are not good enough to fight under General Halleck. They were good enough to defend New Orleans against the British in the War of 1812, but they are not good enough to defend our beleaguered capital. They were good enough to help win American independence, but they are not good enough to help preserve that independence." Early in 1862, things began to accelerate on the subject of emancipation. One of the men who's not credited with pushing this along, but who should be, was General Hunter. He had seized some territory on the coast of South Carolina, and he began enlisting escaped slaves in a regiment that would fight for the Union. President Lincoln intervened, said, "You've overstepped your bounds," just as he had said to Fremont, disbanded the regiment. Could not entertain the proposition yet that black men should be Union soldiers. A month later, Hunter issues what sounds a little like an Emancipation Proclamation. He says slaves in Georgia and South Carolina and in the region of the South which on paper he controlled, they were now free. There was no way he could enforce this. His troops were confined to the coast. It was wishful thinking writ in large letters. But Hunter argued, I am the commander on the ground in a war situation. This is a military necessity. And I think President Lincoln suddenly began to rethink what might be acceptable as a wartime necessity. I think Hunter's action began to open the president's mind. And yet, in 1862, May through July, President Lincoln champions what was called compensated emancipation. He went to the 3 border states with a proposition. He said, we understand your economy is based on the slavery institution. We don't want you to suffer if the slaves are freed, and my government would like to free them. He said to the slave owners in the border states, the federal government will buy your slaves. You will not lose a dime in losing the slaves. The president wanted to show the rebellious states that he was a moderate on the question of slavery. He thought if the border states will accept compensated emancipation, maybe the Confederates will too, and the war will end. This is a chapter we've forgotten. The border states would have none of it. No one accepted compensated emancipation. Things moved along because of that. Frederick Douglass, in that speech at Cooper's Union, summed it up this way. In standing up in the cause of the slaves, I do and you do, but stand up in the defense of the cause of the whole country. The circumstances of this eventful hour make the cause of the slave and the cause of the country identical. They must fall or flourish together. A blow struck for the freedom of the slave is equally a blow struck for the safety and the welfare of the country. All eyes see it, all hearts begin to feel it. It is now or never with us. Is it not as plain as the sun in heaven that slavery is the life, the soul, the inspiration, and the power of the rebellion? Why should we not abolish slavery now? Well, the best the federal government could do in June was to abolish slavery in United States territories. But in July 17th, we began to see a significant change in the thinking in Washington. The Second Confiscation Act was written and put into law. The Second Confiscation Act said that it was now permissible to seize slaves of those who supported the rebellion, which is just what Fremont had been doing in Missouri some months earlier. Insurrectionary purposes were no longer the trigger mechanism for seizing the slaves. Now, if you were a secessionist and you gave voice to that opinion, the federal government could take your slaves. The gloves were coming off. On July 23rd, as we now know, President Lincoln showed the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. He justified it as a war measure. He said, the South cannot maintain its armies in the field unless the farms back home are productive. And the farms cannot be productive without slave labor. We will starve the Confederate armies if we remove the slaves from the Southern economic system. I am arguing for emancipation based on the necessities of war. This was a very politically wise construct, because there were men in the North who were willing to fight for the Union, but would have no part in fighting for the slaves. But this, arguing that releasing the slaves from their Southern masters would end the war sooner and save the Union, this brought over the conservatives in the North, who otherwise would have objected. So, Lincoln discusses this in his cabinet, and Secretary Seward says, Mr. President, I support the idea, but do not make the announcement now. If you make the announcement now, while we are losing on the battlefields, this will seem a hollow and a desperate gesture. Wait until we have won a victory, and then you can make this announcement from a position of strength. I said at the beginning that the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation were preposterous, and they were. Here's what Mr. Lincoln wanted to do. These were to be the terms. If the rebellious states did not lay down their arms by January 1st, 1863, the slaves living in the rebellious states would be henceforth and forever free. But like General Hunter on the coast of Carolina, the president had no means of enforcing this. Where this law would apply, the Confederate States, Lincoln, he couldn't reach into the Confederate States. He had no power there. The only slave states that he could touch and he could reach were those 3 border states. And this law did not apply to the border states. Slaves in the loyal states would still be slaves. It was absurd on its face. And consider this. Consider the improbable proposition that the South actually would lay down their arms on January 1st, 1863. Had they done that, they would have been able to keep their slaves. Mr. Lincoln was making it clear that the cause of saving the Union still had the higher priority than freeing the slaves. More from Frederick Douglass, more food for thought. And I tell you, I thought about it. Injustice, oppression, and slavery have been tried with us during a period of more than 200 years. Under the whole heavens you will find no parallel to the wrongs we have endured. We have worked without wages, we have lived without hope, we have wept without sympathy and bled without mercy. Now, in the name of common humanity, and according to the law of the living God, we simply ask the right to bear the responsibility of our own existence. It is affirmed that the Negro, if emancipated, could not take care of himself. My answer to this is, let him have a fair chance to try. For 200 years he has taken care of himself and his master into the bargain, and I have no reason to believe he could not take care, and very excellent care, of himself when having only himself to support. August 14th, President Lincoln meets with some of the black leaders of Washington, D.C. Does he talk about emancipation? He does not. This is still a secret. The Emancipation Proclamation is still in his pocket. He brings these black leaders into the White House, and here's what he says. It is clear that black Americans and white Americans cannot live together. I wish it were otherwise, but it is a fact. You know I support colonizing Liberia in Africa, sending black Americans back to that continent from which their ancestors were stolen. I have come up with another place for them to go in Central America. the government will give black Americans large sums of money to help them migrate out of the United States to Africa or Central America. Please spread the word in your congregations and communities. And yet he has the Emancipation Proclamation in his coat pocket all the time. The black leaders, incidentally, rejected the notion out of hand. September 17th, finally a victory. It is at Antietam. It's actually a draw. Neither army decimates the other, but the rebels do retreat from the battlefield, so it's enough of a victory. And on September 22nd, President Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation with that deadline of January 1st, 1863. Immediately, this changes the balance of political opinion in Europe, and this matters. England is on the brink of recognizing the South as an independent nation. If they do that, and European armaments flow to the South, the Confederacy might win the war. England is very close to recognizing the Confederacy. With this announcement, England re-examines the American war. Slavery has been illegal in England for years and years and years, and now the English say, my heavens, those people in Washington are fighting the war to free slaves. That is a very noble thing. We cannot support the South. We can't. So initially, in the greater political realm, this announcement bore fruit. I want to mention something that followed hard on the heels of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This has been lost in our history. 2 days later, President Lincoln issued another proclamation suspending the writ of habeas corpus nationwide. Habeas corpus, as you probably know, is in the Constitution. It guarantees that if anyone is arrested, he will not be held indefinitely. He will be brought to court. He will face charges. He will be able to answer charges. President Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He had done this earlier in the war in Maryland when publishers were printing newspapers urging secession, urging young men to fight for the South. He had jailed some Maryland editors, provoking a confrontation with our Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney, the man who articulated the Dred Scott decision, fought President Lincoln tooth and nail on this. And President Lincoln ignored him. Now, the suspension of habeas corpus is nationwide. If you're a Southern sympathizer and you're picked up, you're going to rot in jail indefinitely. The writ cannot apply in the South, in the Confederate States. American power, federal power doesn't reach there yet. This was aimed at Southern sympathizers in the North, who were called Copperheads. In these twin proclamations, President Lincoln talks about freeing the slaves, suspending constitutional rights. Now the gloves are off. There's going to be no negotiated settlement with the South. Now, I have to tell you, when I heard about the habeas corpus decision, I was very uneasy. I was not a constitutional scholar. I was not sure about the ethical arguments on this issue, but it made me uneasy. But I must tell you this. When I was president, I also suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and I did it in South Carolina. It was 1871. We were trying to reconstruct the South to make sure the freed slaves had civil rights, to determine what civil rights the old rebels would have returned to them. And in reaction to that, as you remember, terrorist groups sprang up all over the South, the Ku Klux Klan being one of the largest and most vicious of them. And the Klan, in 1871, seized 9 counties in South Carolina. The state government couldn't cope. The Klan was murdering, it was committing arson. These were state crimes, but the state government could not enforce the law. So, in 1871, I went to Congress and I said, I need a federal authorization to intervene in anarchy. Congress gave me the authority. I did two things. I told the Klan they had 2 weeks to lay down their arms. And I also told them that if they didn't, habeas corpus would be suspended in those 9 counties and federal troops would come in. The Klan did not lay down their arms. Federal troops went in. 3,000 Klansmen were apprehended. The Klan was broken. The lower level thugs were given token sentences. Their leaders were given longer sentences. And their leaders served their time in the federal prison in Albany, New York. In any case, I actually implemented suspended habeas corpus. And I could only justify it in my own mind because the rule of law no longer existed in those counties. It was anarchy. It really was. And so a temporary suspension where we could apprehend the terrorists and hold them for as long as we needed to question them, I felt was justified. Perhaps constitutionally it wasn't, but I'm glad I did it at the time. All right, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation's been announced. How did this play out in the West, where my armies were? Late in 1862, early 63, runaway slaves were still coming into my camps. But now they were bringing their families, men, women, children. Instead of a handful of male slaves, there were hundreds of families, hundreds of them. I was not responsible for them legally, but I had now come to understand I was responsible for them morally. I had to do something. So, could not enlist the men as soldiers, but I could hire them as civilians, just as I had hired free blacks in Missouri. I hired the black men as teamsters, as men who would help, admittedly, with the menial chores around the camps, but I would pay them. And the wives would be seamstresses. They would be laundresses, and I would pay them. And I opened schools for their children and schools for the adults because, as you know, it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. They came into my camps illiterate. I was not obliged to do this by law, but by now I understood there's such a thing as moral law too. All right. One of the great assertions made by the old planter class in the South was not only were blacks lazy, but they were cowards. They would never stand up for their own rights. No white man would have ever submitted to slavery, ever. Only the timid black men would submit. Frederick Douglass was a historian. In his speech at Cooper Union, he looked at European history, and he cited time and time again how in Europe, white men had been held as slaves. One of his paragraphs reads, "The misfortunes of my own race are not singular. They have happened to all nations. The Jews, the Indians, the Saxons, and the ancient Britons have all known the bitter taste of slavery." Well, things are moving in a very clear direction now. But I have to admit there were moments of embarrassment. Julia came to visit me several times at my headquarters in Mississippi. And one time she brought a slave girl with her. Her father insisted, and it wasn't illegal, but it was mortifying. President Lincoln was appalled. I was embarrassed, and it never happened again. Just because something was legal didn't mean it was right. January 1st, 1863. The previous night in churches all across the North, black people had been assembling, waiting to hear that President Lincoln had finally signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And when the word came, there was great joy in the North. And then that joy redoubled because President Lincoln added something to the final Emancipation Proclamation that had not been in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He said that it was now permissible to enlist black men in the Union Army. The tide began to turn. Frederick Douglass again. It is one of the strangest and most humiliating triumphs of human selfishness and prejudice over human reason that leads men to look upon emancipation as an experiment. Slavery, not freedom, is the experiment. Frederick Douglass argued that it is in the nature of humanity to crave freedom. And he was right. What did I see in the West now that black men could enlist? Would they fight? That was the question everyone was asking. May 27th, 1863, the grand assault on Port Hudson, Louisiana. There are regiments of blacks participating in the assault. The assault fails. The rebels push the Yankees back. But the black regiments behaved with just as much gallantry as the white regiments. General Banks told me that that was the case. I did not see it with my own eyes, but I believed him. 10 days later, at Milliken's Bend, also in Louisiana, very close to Vicksburg. Milliken's Bend was a supply station that I had control over. Freed slaves, just enlisted in the Army, some who had just been given their weapons the day before, were attacked by hardened Confederates and fought them hand to hand and would not surrender. Those black soldiers knew there would be no quarter, that if they were taken, they would be killed, perhaps returned to slavery, probably not. They fought to the death, hand to hand, and they won. And suddenly the North saw that black men would fight for their own freedom. July 4th, Vicksburg falls, my troops march in. July 9th, Port Hudson falls. It's on the Mississippi. It's the last garrison. General Banks's troops march in. The Mississippi is now a Union stream from Minnesota to the Gulf. And immediately, we send into the Mississippi Valley General Lorenzo Thomas. He goes to the plantations. He says to the newly freed slaves, "You may enlist in the Union Army. Are you interested?" 21,000 enlisted from the plantations into the Union Army. I appointed Chaplain John Eaton to take care of the civilians. By that I mean the families of the black enlisted men. Chaplain Eaton enlarged what I had begun earlier. He set up schools for the families. He set up economic models that would earn the slaves, former slaves, real wages. He asked, "Your masters have run away from the plantations. Would you consider staying, harvesting the crops? The Union Army needs all of these things. We will pay you a decent wage if you will stay where you were formerly slaves." And many did. We employed freed slaves chopping wood for the steamboats, our gunboats on the Mississippi. And we did something that I think is unprecedented. I know it was unprecedented. We began forming cooperatives. Jefferson Davis's plantation was seized. It was at, of course, Davis Bend on the Mississippi. We brought in former slaves, and in the beginning, we taught them about economics. They had no more clue about money than they had about reading or writing to begin with. But they worked together to build a community that would be self-sustaining economically. That was in 1863, and here it is, 1880, and I am pleased to say that that cooperative still exists. There's no more instructions from the white men. The black people have proved at Davis Bend that they can form a community that can feed and clothe and house everyone. As we were setting up this cooperative, I said something off the cuff. I said to one of my aides, the slaves have lived in hell all their lives. I hope Davis Bend can become a paradise for them. A reporter heard me, and in the papers shortly thereafter it said, Grant establishes Negro paradise. And across the South they mocked me. They thought it would never work. But here it is, all these years later, and it has worked. Port Hudson was turned into a training camp for black men who are in our armies now. Their families lived there too. And General Banks gave me an image. This is so perfect, I almost don't believe it's real. But General Banks wasn't terribly imaginative, so I think it was real. He said that one day he saw recruits trying to learn how to march. Former slaves, now in their blue uniforms, first time they have rifles on their shoulders, trying to march in step, and doing pretty well. But he said there was a soldier at the end of the line who was out of step. He just couldn't match up his steps with anybody else. And Banks took a closer look, and he realized that this new soldier with the rifle on his shoulder had a book in his other hand. And as he walked and tried to march, he was trying to teach himself the alphabet at the same time. That is the image of where the newly freed slaves were in those first months, becoming soldiers and learning how to read and write and begin new lives. 180,000 black men would serve in our armies, 180,000. They would not be paid wages equal to the white soldiers. I think it was about 2/3 for most of the war. They fought in 449 engagements. 40,000 of them died in battle and of disease. On January 11th, 1865, 3 months before the war ended, the state of Missouri decided that it would make slavery illegal in Missouri. This was one of the border states where slavery, despite the Emancipation Proclamation, was still legal. Missouri finally abolishes slavery. Colonel Dent's slaves, the second they heard that, walked away from his estate. They walked away. Some of them ran. Colonel Dent, as the saying used to be, was slave rich and cash poor. When his slaves left, he suddenly was in very deep economic distress. I will say he's done better since. When you have a son-in-law who has been president, your fortunes will pick up a little bit. But for a moment, Colonel Dent was like all the other slave owners across the South, facing what he thought was decimating poverty, and he was scared. All right, the war ended. The war ended in April 1865. But the Emancipation Proclamation did not, the process rather did not. And here's why. emancipation had been justified as a war measure. And someone thought this through and they said, now just a second. If a president unilaterally can say, we will end slavery because we are at war, cannot the next president say, well, now we are at peace and we will reinstitute slavery? Emancipation had to be made permanent, and the only way to do that was through a constitutional amendment. Slavery was finally abolished permanently on December 6th, 1865. This was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And that was not the end of the process either. You would have thought, and we have this tendency to think, after Appomattox, all was well everywhere. In the South, the slaves were now free, but they were not considered citizens. The Dred Scott decision, which had come down before the war, was still in effect, which said quite clearly that black people are not citizens of the United States. They are residents. They do not have the rights of citizens. And in the South, because they were mere residents, black people were falling under the tyranny of the Klan again, and there was nothing they could do because they had no rights. So citizenship had to be defined. And that was finally defined under the 14th Amendment on July 9th, 1869. It made it clear that if you are born in this country, you are a citizen. That's all that is required. So now it appeared that in the South, the freed slaves and the old rebels were finally on equal terms. But they weren't. Just because you're a citizen doesn't mean you have the right to vote. Women couldn't vote. The old rebels were coming back to power in their state governments. They were enacting laws called the Black Codes, which defined the types of jobs black people could have. And when you boiled it all down, the jobs they could have were the jobs they had held as slaves. Only now, they were supposedly free. And as free men, the law required that they must sign labor contracts by the first of the year. And if they didn't, they would be imprisoned for vagrancy. Clearly, what was needed now, the people framing these laws were the old rebels. If black people could have the right to vote, they could now influence the laws as they were evolving in the South. They had to have the right to vote. This would eventually be resolved with the 15th Amendment, which says that the right to vote cannot be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. I was elected, I took office as president in March of 1869, and I lobbied and I campaigned hard for this amendment. And it finally became law in February of 1870. I called a special session of Congress, and at that point I said this: a measure which makes at once 4 million people voters who were hitherto declared by the highest tribunal in the land not citizens of the United States or eligible to become so. This enactment is indeed a measure of grander importance than any other act of its kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. I believed it then and I believe it now. As president, there were many conflicts with the old secessionists. I told you about South Carolina. There were many more incidents of that kind. To enforce the new laws pertaining to civil rights, I organized a new cabinet position, the Justice Department. I I helped craft a civil rights law. The civil rights of the freed slaves had to mean something real. And that fight was fought again and again and again as I was president. My re-election came up in 1872. And Frederick Douglass, who had inspired me through his speech at Cooper Union, worked for my re-election. He wrote a campaign brochure, which he distributed in the black communities. And I want to read two excerpts. Speaking of the Grant administration. First subject, about Klan terrorism. These outrages, the burning of schoolhouses and churches, the whipping and shooting of teachers, the midnight murder of men and women by masked villains, were so contrary to the ideas of the country that they hardly seemed possible in a civilized land. But by the quiet yet firm course of General Grant in enforcing the law, thousands of Klansmen have openly acknowledged the crimes charged. Their organization stands confessed, to the amazement of all good men, North and South, and peace has come to many places as never before. The scourging and the slaughter of our people have ceased. I wanted to make a point that if given the opportunity and the education, black people could be as good employees as white people. And so, to the extent I could, I opened up jobs in the government for the newly freed slaves. Frederick Douglass wrote this. Now this is, again, 1872. I've been in office 4 years. Douglass says, "It is impossible for me to fix an exact number, but I find appointees of our color in all departments of the civil service. 2 have been appointed foreign ministers, several collectors of customs, some assessors of the internal revenue, and so on down through route agents, postmasters, clerks, messengers, etc. In one department in Washington, I found 249 men of color. I am satisfied that there has been a hearty disposition to disregard all past prejudices and to treat us in the matter of appointments according to our merit." According to our merit. Frederick Douglass also mentioned that the first black cadets were now attending West Point. I want to close with 2 more observations. I want to hearken back to my special session of Congress when the 15th Amendment was passed. This was included in my remarks. Institutions like ours, in which all power is derived directly from the people, must depend mainly upon their intelligence, patriotism, and industry. I call attention, therefore, of the newly enfranchised race to the importance of their striving in every honorable manner to make themselves worthy of the new privilege, the right to vote. And to the race more favored heretofore by our laws, I would say, withhold no legal privilege of advancement from the new citizen. In other words, if a man has merit, ignore the color of his skin and see the merit. We have to make these reminders year in and year out. The process is not over. And here's my final commentary. Julia and I are just back to the United States. After we left the White House, we went on an around-the-world tour. And everywhere we went, we were met by this same reaction. In every country, and I don't care if it's Europe or the Orient, foreign nations are in awe of us. They believe that we are extraordinary in human history. Foreigners cannot remember a time ever in the history of the world when one race went to war to free another race. Now, you and I know it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that simple. But we also know this. When finally given the chance, black people fought for their freedom, and they fought well. We did not emancipate them. We stood together, and both races were emancipated. The process begun by the Emancipation Proclamation continues. It continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We will be doing some tours now. Probably we'll start one tour in the house, one on the porch, but for the rest of you, would you like to accompany me down to the overlook, which is a key part of this site. General Grant was there a couple of times. There's a beautiful view of the Hudson Valley and some historical markers, and I would be happy to give you a tour down there. So we'll gather down here.